Hey, welcome to this week's Deep Dive. We are in our final week of our Through the Lens teaching series where we're looking at movies and culture and asking questions like, hey, what can we learn about the world we live in? What can we learn about God and creation and ourselves? And using movies as kind of conversation partners for that. And so today, joined by Pastor Mike Sherman, Pastor Dan Borth, we're going to kind of talk about love and romance.
That's
and
why we're here.
All
That's
the
why Dan
feels.
and I
That's
are
why
here.
I specifically asked, you
Yeah.
guys
Brought
to
in the
join.
experts.
Love experts.
Funny thing is, right, in my time in youth, right, we would bring in panels from time to time to, address the questions of our...
To say things you didn't feel like saying.
Absolutely.
Probably. Yeah,
100%.
right. I've been in that situation before.
100%.
It's a smart move.
But anyway, yeah, talking love, talking romance. It's a theme that you can't get away from when you watch movies.
Try as you might.
Even movies you wouldn't
Yes.
think. We're just talking about this. Movies that you wouldn't think have romance as like Pearl Harbor. You go into there thinking that's a war movie, and it's more of a romance movie than it is a war movie.
Yeah.
Anyway, Hollywood, they get you every time. But anyway, so what is it, guys, about love, about romance that translates to the screen? Like, why are we looking for that?
I mean, well, this whole series has been common human themes that are part of this bigger story. And how do we tell stories about it, and how do stories interact with that so we can understand ourselves better and the story that we're in better. It's pretty hard to get more common in terms of a story than some sort of romantic love. Mm-hmm. People either have it or want to have it. It's how families come to be and so on. And it's obviously people have been telling, romantic love stories for a long, long, long time. Probably for as long as there's been people. So it's no surprise that it's a common element in lots of movies, including movies that aren't, relationship movies or, love stories sort of thing, that because it's common to humanity.
Yeah, no, that's good. Dan, what?
Yeah, I think so. Confession. I like romance as a genre. I've always just been uncomfortable with, and I couldn't explain why. I'm still mad that For Love of the Game, Kevin Costner, baseball, and it was about his relationship with, his
Not about baseball.
person. It was not about baseball, and I'm angry. It was I was duped, but it's okay. It's funny for me. My access point then is thinking about, okay, so why am I uncomfortable about this? There is, in whether it's movies or streaming things, romance is an incredibly common theme. It's almost always pressed and pushed. But I guess in like thinking about that, like I have to give some space to appreciate that romantic stories are pointing to the fact that romance is like the relationship between people isn't uncommon, but that the adventure that comes with romance, the tension that comes with romance, the trouble that comes with romance, like it's like a magnetic pull that pulls a character through their story arc, and that resonates in my own life. Like I love my wife Mandy very much. We have an incredibly romantic relationship. I have great relationships with many other, women in my life, but nothing quite like that. Nothing that's pulled me through parts of my story or into parts of hers quite like that. So, I appreciate it. I'm really excited. I think, Mike's really good with stories in general. Yeah. I'm excited. I feel like I'm here as a learner today. But yeah, romance is not... It's common, yes, but it's such an uncommon thing at the same time. And so I just feel all sorts of tensions, and I'm not sure where this is going to go.
Yeah, no, I'm not super sure either. But I do think that with this conversation, it's interesting because, when you look at movies, a lot of times, especially with the romance as the kind of the meta theme or love's meta theme, you have these grand gestures that happen. You have these, almost just statements about love that don't always line up with the mundane, routine, everyday nature of
I think that's hard. It's hard to portray what a real loving relationship is in a movie, because movies, by their very nature, are sort of a heightened reality. I mean, a movie that just followed somebody's life for 2 hours wouldn't be a movie anybody watched. I mean, so by the very nature, life is sort of compressed into all the interesting parts about this story are pressed together so we can watch them in 2 hours. And that necessarily distorts things, and it distorts romance. And so I do think there is an everydayness to actual loving, the long-term commitment of loving, in which feeling goes up and down, is hard to portray. But that's the reality. Not only that's the reality, that's the, in a sense, intended reality.
Yeah.
That you're not dependent on a feeling in order to act in a loving manner. Feelings come and go. Christ's commitment to us is unwavering, even wherever we are, in our feelings towards Him. And I do think there's a correspondence there between our love and romantic love and Christ's love for us. So I think that's part of the problem, if you will, with loving relationships in a movie, is that it's hard. It's just a hard thing to portray in a way that's accurate.
Yeah.
And because the accurate part kind of plays out over a long time.
Yeah.
And then sometimes what you see is like Marriage Story is a movie in which there's a very realistic portrayal of a marriage, but the marriage is coming apart. That's the whole movie is
so
the marriage
Story,
is
Netflix, Adam Driver, Scarlett Johansson. The characters, they are involved in the theater. One is a director, one's an actress, and in the movie, essentially they each give up something for the other, or they're unwilling to give up something for.
Right. And that, so the marriage comes apart, and it's really a story of the end of this relationship. And there's a lot of betrayals and stuff that go along with it. And there's some incredibly emotional scenes, but they correspond to a marriage coming apart over a long period of time, where it's hard to capture that on the front end without sort of idealizing it and making it seem, I don't know, like fake.
Well, how many romance, movies is the story not after they've gotten together and they're experiencing life and they're doing that journey? It's the conflict or the tension leading up to, and then the story kind of ends with the two characters getting together. And I think sometimes that for us,
and then happily ever after,
and then happily
right.
ever after is assumed, and so then for us it's more like it becomes a destination rather than like a journey.
And I do think there's a cultural, like, if I find the right person, then happily ever after.
Yeah.
Right. And there is no happily ever after here on this earth. Some days are happy and some days are not. And that's part of the living in this story that we're in as fallen people. And I do think that's part of maybe what makes romance in the movies seem, I don't know what the word, idealized or, overly, something.
Pedestal.
But it does speak to something, I think, real, is that we all have this longing to be loved, to be in a relationship of love, that provides some meaning. That's a constant theme. I did criticize Hallmark movies, but there's a reason that they have an appeal. It's because all of us are drawn to some sort of loving relationship.
It's part of a story that we're drawn to.
Yeah.
And in a way it speaks to, we're created.
Yeah, made for. Mm-hmm.
I think one of the biggest questions, this is really helpful, actually, and I'm laughing at myself because I just realized one of my favorite romantic movies I'll talk about in a second, but it makes me think that this romantic theme, the genre, it is, I think, the biggest literary video genre. It's the one with some of the most extremes. You have the very kind, good-natured Hallmark, and you have some of the most extreme stuff, the 50 Shades of Grey that's
Mm-hmm.
explicitly sexual, but
Mm-hmm.
still teasing at the romance theme, and caught a lot of people's attention, in our culture. I think on a basic level, and I don't know how high of a priority, but romance as an experience asks the question, how much can love from someone else change me? And so here's why I'm laughing. Because years ago, I watched this movie called Warm Bodies. Did either of you see this? It was a zombie movie. It was a zombie.
I was going to say it sounds like a
Sounds
zombie
like
movie.
a zombie.
It was a rom-com.
Okay.
Okay,
Zom
That's-
rom-com,
That's
like
the
it.
setup.
Zombies need romance too.
Zomedy.
Well, apparently, romance
Yeah.
is the thing that could save them, and it's
Okay.
really an interesting premise that this
redemption.
So for
young
you
man-
zombies
It
out
is.
there,
Yes.
For any zombies who are watching, there's a person for you, and they will warm your heart. No, in a nutshell, this zombie guy is loved by this human girl, but like not her actions of love are real, and this romance that is happening between them does drag them through this, of course, incredible story arc. We're starting with a rom-com, but in the end, it's her. Commitment, her devotion, her actual interest in him that actually warms his heart. It actually brings his heart back
It
to life.
unzombifies him.
Yes, and the resolution to the zombie problem in this movie is that people actually start caring for each other,
All we need is love.
whether as friends or whatever. Deep movie,
Yes.
for sure. However, I see those themes, and I see, a little bit of what I was drawn to. I see a little bit of why I think we as Christians need to not be squeamish about romance, but instead need to embrace maybe romance in our own stories. Need to talk about those things as ways that are the romance we feel is both actual and allegorical. I think we're going to go there in a minute. But anyway, yeah, that's my...
No, that's good. That's really good, Dan. One of the things I think for a lot of, at least for my story, a lot of other people's stories too, when it comes to romance, there's almost like a you don't really want to talk about it. You don't want to put yourself out there. I remember like having conversations with my parents. I just want to be like, hey, let's just not have this conversation. And I do wonder about that. I think when it comes to romance, when it comes to love, there's a certain level of vulnerability that's required, right? You can't have it without that.
Right. Intimacy, vulnerability. Right. And that's what some people don't like about those movies, probably. It makes them feel a little, something. And that's probably hard to portray well and accurately. But there is a level of, intimacy and vulnerability that it enables love to go in a positive direction, of course, but it also opens you up for pain.
For pain.
Yeah.
And actually, that's often more common,
Yeah.
right? The
Yeah.
pain. I think, you're talking about finding a relationship, finding somebody to be in a relationship with, and oftentimes there's more rejection than there is, whatever the opposite of that acceptance
yeah.
is. And so I don't know. I think movies do allow us to almost experience that, or they portray it for us in a way that's safer, but yet still touches that. Another question I wanted to kind of flesh out before we continue. I think TV shows often, and maybe because of the format of them, they're longer. A successful TV show goes multiple seasons. And I think of The Office, right? I'm an Office fan.
Jim and Pam,
right? Like
You've-
there is
you've
something
mentioned this before.
once or twice, yes. But I do wonder, whenever we're watching, The Office. And it's really a story of their relationship in an ordinary, but obviously not ordinary setting. At the end of the series, the writers wanted to do something different. They wanted to try to shake things up a little bit. And so they introduced this real complication to their relationship, to the point where it was on the table. Are they going to stay together? And my wife hated that storyline. She hated it. She's like, that's not Jim and Pam. That's not consistent with the rest of the show. And I'm like, the realist over here. I'm like, well, we don't get to see every moment of their lives. We only see them at the office. Like,
they're imaginary.
They've been together now for 7 years. Like, at some point, there's going to be things that threaten. There's going to be things. So actually, I think it was a fairly, they didn't do a great job with it, but I think it was a fairly realistic, portion.
I think that brings up a really important point. I do see more movies and shows willing to explore that dynamic where romance, relationship, intimacy will always continue to provide an opportunity, at least, for the negative sides of that, for rejection, for pain. And that's implicit, I think, in the dynamic of such a special relationship. And I wonder how we carry that. I wonder what ideas that I assume, my relationship, whether it's with my wife, whether it's with friends, whether it's with the Lord, like, can't go to painful places, or maybe the closer we are, the more we'll find ourselves in those places, the more I might find myself in insecure moments, or in just in spots where my sense of identity is being challenged. I remember being floored, favorite author C.S. Lewis, but he was the first that helped me understand one of the miracles of Christ's life, his perfect life. It wasn't his sinlessness. It was that his intimacy with the Father took him to a place where he was going to experience rejection. He was going to experience pain in the deepest places and senses. And so maybe there is something very true in the romantic storytelling that to be loved well does not insulate us from difficulty or from pain, from the potential for being left high and dry.
Yeah, it's part of the story.
It is. Yeah. And it's not, I can't say that it all turns out well in every time, but there doesn't seem to be anything in the heart of God that treats romance lightly. Like, God seems to be a person who understands the depth and the potential in all senses of romance. I think that's why the Song of Songs in the Bible is such a gift. You don't get this perfectly resolved story, but you get this demonstration, this poetic expression of intense longing and desire.
Well, even in Genesis, right? Whenever Adam's alone, right? Like, God sees that, and there's different ways you can interpret that. Like, is that, was he alone romantically, or was he alone just in that he was the only human and needed, relationship? Either way, I think that speaks to this. And I think, Dan, that's quite astute. One of the things that came up teaching team this past week, as we're kind of discussing this, was a rising trend of seeing young couples especially cohabitate rather than get married. I think that what you're speaking to says something about where culture is going, or at least how culture understands love.
Yeah, I think we perhaps have an expectation of the avoidance of pain, or a sense in which pain means failure, or a sense in which life should be easy and not hard, and all of that is going to probably make it much more difficult to get into a lifelong loving relationship, because that's risk, that's pain, that's hard. And so I do think you see a trend of people who are afraid to get married, and this is self-identified, because maybe their parents got divorced, or their parents didn't have a good relationship, or so on. And yet what they have is a series of 1 to 2 to 3 year relationships that keep ending when things get hard. And then they never really have, they, in a sense, can have the worst of both worlds. They never really have the commitment, and they do have the pain. And so there's that kind of there's no way around it. There's no way around, there is no happily ever after. We are made for a loving commitment to one another, and that's going to involve risk and pain and so forth. And we talked about Ephesians 5, where you have this parallel between, he's talking about a husband and his wife and their commitment for each other, and, submission and laying down life, and, which are not, these are not probably in the brochure of, it's not in the Hallmark movie. Neither of those probably
neither of them make
occur. The cut. And as he's talking about this, this loving, permanent commitment, and then he goes, oh, but I'm also talking about Christ and the church.
Yeah.
And I think what I like about that is, obviously, Christ dies for the church. So, I mean, the pattern of sacrifice we talked about a couple weeks ago and the pattern of love go together. And we should not expect to love well without sacrificing or have it cost us something. And I also would say, I think it's important for us to say, the notion that we are made for one grand romantic relationship in our lifetime, which is Hallmarkish maybe. I mean, Jesus was single, Paul was single. It's, if you're unmarried, if you've been single all your life, it doesn't mean you're living a lesser life or that something essential is missing, because the husband and wife relationship is a real, of course, important relationship, but it points to this greater thing, that this eternal relationship between Christ and the church that other relationships can point to as well. And that's what we're really made for. And I do feel like, I think that, for a lot of people who are single and would rather be with someone, all of the talk of love stories can be sort of painful, probably.
Yeah.
But I do think that's Jesus didn't live a less than life, or nor did Paul. He lived exactly the life, he was called to live. And so I just think it's important to say that you're not a failure as a human. Yeah. You're not defective. There's nothing wrong with you if you're not in a relationship like this, or perhaps if you never get into a relationship like this, because again, Jesus, Paul, lots of people who lived the life God had for them to live, lived it well and had joy and so forth. They lived a similar life as well.
Yeah, so there's two places I want to go with that. One, in the context of even Ephesians 5, the husband-wife relationship is just one of the relationships that's mentioned. Paul, he's writing, to give this kind of new, robust image for every relationship that people find themselves in, and kind of putting that into the context of the relationship that Christ has with the church. And the other thing is I want to kind of take this is, why do you guys think that? Because that's something that I have heard, at least implicitly, from people who are single, is that marriage is something, at least within Christian circles, that's upheld as this mark of success. That if you're not married, if you're not in a relationship, then you're broken, you're not doing the thing right. And I'm really sad when I hear those stories, because I know how powerful it is. Dan, I know you've spent a number of years as a youth pastor and then as college pastor, so this is, I'm sure, a story that you're familiar with in that. But what is it there? How does the church contribute to that narrative, and how do we even see maybe movies contribute to that narrative as well?
Yeah, I would offer this sensitively and gently, and I wouldn't say that this is a hardline stance I'd take, but I do think that in the church we should probably grow to be better romantic story keepers and better romantic story makers. And the reason I say that is because marriage seemed to get elevated, especially out of the 90s, because of the rise of hookup culture that was coming, in the early 2000s. There was a sense that we really wanted to teach our teenagers, of which I was one, that a sense of chastity was going to be God-honoring and helpful in life. And it just seemed like the equation was...
And a reward was coming
for
that
reward
too.
Might be marriage. Yeah. And I do think we've tempered that a bit, but we also, I don't know that we've talked about marriage exactly the way the Bible does. I mean, Paul says, Mandy got mad at me when we were going to get married, and she's going to be thrilled that this is now on the internet, but I'm going to say it.
She's not watching.
She's not. No,
fine. You're fine.
She will now. On our marriage thing on our handout, I wanted the verse to be not let love be sincere, nothing like that. I wanted it to be, if the two cannot contain themselves, they should marry. 1 Corinthians 7, Paul accounts for. Now that was a joke, honey.
Yeah.
We didn't do that, but even Paul, in talking to people, asking these questions about singleness and marriage, accounts for this sense that romance is this powerful thing, and it will draw people into a kind of relationship that, to be God-honoring, they probably should marry. Same thing in Song of Songs. Don't arouse or awaken love until it so desires. Like, the Bible is very comfortable with the idea of romance in humanity. I don't know that where we've been, at least in my experience as the church, has appreciated that or grown to do that. I see it on the back end of relationships that maybe marriages that end in divorce. We have talked a lot about the definitions of divorce, what's appropriate for Christians, what Christians should try to do. I wonder if maybe we should talk more about how challenging romance is, and how someone whose marriage did end or the next step has been divorce, and now they're still a beautiful person. They're still someone who bears the image of God, who's processing all of that, and probably on a much deeper level than even before the fact that they had to experience a separation like that. So I just think, as friends and as brothers and sisters in Christ, yes, we should always refer to Scripture, but we should probably work really hard to know all of Scripture and to be as holistic, as aware of the whole person, as gracious, as well as committed to a life of holiness as Scripture calls us to. Paul said in Ephesians 5, he says, this is a mystery. I'm talking about Christ in the church. I think he can do that because I think there's something in romance that's a bit mysterious by nature as well. So it's actual and it's allegorical. And that is the kind of what God has given us. Like, he's given us this world where romance is both actual and possible and hard and can be hoped
and
for.
Points to something else, yeah.
Yeah, and
So,
I don't,
yeah.
I think that we're at our worst if we oversimplify it.
I also think there's a couple other things going on there that, sometimes when we say the church, we mean the suburban evangelical church, which has been our experience, which is largely made up of, or the target audience might be families. And it's fair to point that out, that churches do tend to speak to families. And there's some reason for that, but, there's also, some sensitivity that not everyone here is in a family that, in the same sense that we're speaking to. So that's a real thing. I also think that what, the church does this often is just the culture does this. And I experience it through the church because the church is impacted by culture. The culture elevates sex and the expression of your sexuality to some essential level. Like, if you're not expressing your true sexual self, you're living a less than life. Well, in the church, that means marriage. That's what I mean. That's sort of like what you were talking about. So, but that's a cultural statement. That's not a biblical statement. And I think that's the point where the church could probably say that's something our culture says, but that isn't true. That's kind of what I was trying to say before. You're not living a less than life. And there can be and should be room for that, and that there can and should be celebration of that. And I think that's just difficult in our church context, but partly it's made difficult because our culture sort of looks on that as a less than life, which is tragic.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you guys. We've tackled.
Let's end on that note.
Yeah, let's end on that happy, exciting, optimistic note. Anyway, thank you for joining us for this week's deep dive. We're starting a new teaching series next week about the church. We're going to be looking at things that the church should be known for, things and actions that we are all called to. It's going to be called "It Runs in the Family," and so really excited to dive into that. And we will catch you again next week.